Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's July the 7th, 1978, tape number 334, side 1. November the 22nd, 1963 is when President John Kennedy was assassinated. And when I began my research, that 2 days later, the day that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald, I never dreamt or had any idea what directions this research would be taking me. I bought more newspapers than I was taking. I escalated the reading and read national magazines. Then, of course, I bought the Warren Commission report in September of 1964, and then the 26 volumes of the hearings before the President's Commission that contained the testimony of 552 witnesses and affidavits and documents and exhibits upon which the Warren report was supposed to be based. And as soon as I got to Volume 1 of the first book of hearings where Chief Justice Earl Warren was taking the testimony of Marina Oswald, the wife of Lee Harvey Oswald, I knew immediately that something was wrong because of the way he was asking the questions, the way they were avoiding the hard information they could have received from Marina. And it's interesting now that the House Select Committee in Washington isn't inviting Marina Oswald as a witness. She was the primary witness against Lee Harvey Oswald, and after that, once they got over that hurdle of Marina, the evidence could be manipulated in any way that the Warren Commission wanted. I didn't know where this curiosity would lead me or how far it would go or what I would do with it, but I began to read these various witnesses and look at the exhibits and documents, and I spent 8 years doing that before I published an article or did one radio broadcast. And the thing that I noticed in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where the Warren Commission described a cozy little network of Russians that were interested in Lee and Marina Oswald was the occupations of these people that I'll be writing about in a book someday, how they met Lee and Marina Oswald, and what they were doing before Lee and Marina moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area in 1972, in June of 1972. But as I went down the names, most of them were foreign born. Maybe the husband was in the American Army. The wife was a Tsarist Russian or was in Germany and not in concentration camps. And I noticed this international link to Lee and Marina Oswald. George Bowie was an engineer. I believe he's still alive in Dallas. But he was described as the man who keeps the papers and controls this group, that keeps all the documents on them. And he was the chief organizer of the Greek Orthodox Church of settling these czarists in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and making their contacts to the military intelligence teams. Max and Gally Clark were another couple with American names. Max Clark is American, went to USC, I believe, for his college education. Gally Clark was a Sherbatov. She was described as her family like the Cabots and the Lodges, an aristocratic czarist family, similar to Marina's family, although Marina's family I don't believe was that well known unless she carefully disguised their names. And Gally Clark was never called as a witness. She sat in the room while Max Clark gave testimony, even though she was providing money and clothing for Marina when she stayed at Elena Hall's, and while Lee Harvey Oswald went to Dallas from Fort Worth to get a job in the printing office. Gally Clark was a Sherbatov, and her family's name comes out in links to the Tsarist family. Sherbatovs were high up with the Tsarists, and even with the escape of the Tsarists after the revolution. Lydia Dmitrik, of course, was a Russian-born woman, very mysterious. Her husband was never called as a witness, and she's one of the connecting links because her name was in Marina's notebook, a telephone address, before they left the Soviet Union, and the Warren Commission tried to say that they had no previous contacts before they arrived. But two names were there, unless it's a different Dmitrik. I wouldn't know. It says Hotel Metropole. Lee Harvey Oswald had the name, but being as Lydia was never asked the question, and Marina was never asked the question, did you know each other, or did Lee know you before he came to the Dallas-Fort Worth area? That has remained unanswered in 15 years. Of course, George and Jean DeMohrenschildt have been the silent witnesses. I've tried in lectures at colleges and so forth to talk about them, and I hope to write about them at great length. And George DeMohrenschildt's father managed the Nobel oil fields in the Ukraine, Baku, in Russia, the wealthiest oil fields in the world, the fields that the Rockefellers and Standard Oil wanted to control as early as 1890. And George's name was George von Mohrenschildt. He changed it to DeMohrenschildt to take away some of the German connotation. His brother is bigwig. If he's still alive, I never read that he died. He's at the Hoover Library in Stanford working on revolution and the next wars, very active, very political right. Declan and Kathy Ford were hosts of Lee and Marina Oswald and had international connections and with all of these people that had come from Russia and Germany. It was a source of introductions. Everett Glover was working for oil companies in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and very close to the Mamontovs and the Gravitas and the white Russian community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There was Alex Kleiner and Ilya Mamontov and Mr. Kristanik, who worked in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and had a large role to play with Michael Payne in this story. It seems minute, but it was a large role, and Igor Voshinin and Mrs. Voshinin and Anna Miller and Theo Miller. These were all foreigners from the Tsarist German connections or from Iran, and these were the so-called Russian community that was curious about this little girl that just came to the Dallas-Fort Worth area in 1962. And as the Warren Commission started their work, as I said, I began to study it. They avoided getting an answer when the witness was on the stand. The witness could change the subject and just disregard the question. They avoided hard questions when the witnesses were up there and they could have asked them. They ignored testimony that was good, that was a clue to the direction to go to look for the murders of President Kennedy. They could change their opinions through rewording of questions and be made to say something that they didn't intend to say when they first started. Much of the context was taken out of, much of the testimony was taken out of context, so that what the witness said in the commission hearings is different what the Warren report wrote up. Many people went off the record. The lawyers suggested going off the record if something was getting too hot or too much information was coming out. Outright lies were accepted by the Warren Commission as facts. One lawyer, Albert Jenner, would hear testimony from 10 or 12 witnesses, and Mr. Wesley Liebler was hearing testimony from other witnesses. And these particular people were contradicting each other in different rooms, and they didn't give their testimony before the same tribunal or the same group of staff. Therefore, they could say two different things and never be pinned down to which was the truth. Of course, there was a lot of probably it happened or perhaps it happened, or inasmuch as this happened. This was used all along while the testimony was being taken. And then there was the Fifth Amendment by the extreme rightists, a particular man that worked with General Walker in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And there was late testimony taken. Even Mr. Liebler, as I noticed last week and gave you the printed sheet out in the book Inquest, stated that he wasn't sure that the assassin was properly identified. And that letter was written in September, 2 weeks before the Warren report was presented and sold. And then there were many witnesses that should have been called that never were called, and I have a list of about 40 of the most important witnesses and what they should have been able to be asked and were never asked. And then, of course, we have the many, many witnesses into the hundreds that have been killed so that they never can be called back or asked the right questions, even if they testified once before. They're not with us to ever provide the answers to these questions. But the questions kept going on in my mind, and I pursued this matter, as I say, for 8 years, cross-filing the Warren Commission hearings and getting down to all the things that were wrong with the Warren Commission. And it seemed that the answers weren't so simple. I did this long project for 8 years, and while I was doing it, collecting other books on the assassination, my view was going to the foreign-born and the history of these people that were interested in Lee and Marina Oswald. Most young couples don't get that much attention and get furniture or baby furniture or clothing or transportation and medical bills and dental bills, and they were literally taken over by the white Russian community, and every one of their needs was met. So that, of course, demanded investigating who the members of the Warren Commission were, such as Allen Dulles, who it turned out was making deals with Nazi intelligence in 1943. 44 and 45, Allen Dulles was on the Warren Commission. He represented the oil companies, the Rockefellers, and the huge multinational corporations. And when World War II was over, he was instrumental in resettling these people with Hitler's top Eastern spy, Reinhard Gehlen, in order to to get ready for World War III. And John J. McCloy, of course, the attorney for the Rockefellers, was the commissioner of Germany after World War II and released all the top Nazis and set them on their way again as that great bulwark against Bolshevism. And since that time, I've collected many books, and I will continuously give you sources of books. And I do have an obsession with what I call the Nazi connection, because I think you have to study Germany, you have to study history to really understand how a tribunal of such prestigious people such as Earl Warren, Chief Justice Earl Warren, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, top lawyers from the top corporations, people that had high reputations, were involved in a massive cover-up where the President of the United States was killed, and then the man who was arrested for killing him was shot 2 days later. The answers aren't simple, and I just never rested. I suppose the reason I never got out a book yet on the Kennedy assassination, even though I have much evidence just to write one book after the other, and none of this has ever been published before. There are many books out into the hundreds now, but none of them will have the material in the way that I broke it down and researched it. But there's been a stumbling block to my writing it, and it has always been to fit those other pieces in. And the pieces that are coming in now that you're getting in the printout sheets with the books and titles are the explanations for all the assassinations. They're the explanations for the many military dictatorships we put into power after World War II. You would think after we had the atomic bomb and the Holocaust and the displacement of 80 million people and another 80 million killed, counting those troops from all over the world and civilians and so forth, that the major goal on planet Earth after the Second World War would be peace. It just seems logical, after so much pain and suffering, that there would be peace. But peace wasn't in the offing. The people that like the wars, that make the weapons, that like to control the minerals and the wealth and the slave labor, have no intention of peace. And it seems that we have never had a moment of peace since the end of World War II. But there's a book that I want to talk about on this tape, on this side and the other side, because I think it's one of the big pieces of the puzzle of how did Germany not only get so strong, but where are they today, and how are we hoodwinked today? And that, of course, goes into the subject of use of mind control, of mass population mind control through the media, particularly through the media and the corporations, until we are getting into World War III, and we're just about there at this point. They're rattling the sabers right now and getting us ready for World War III. As a matter of fact, they did a rerun, maybe some of you saw it last week, of Edward R. Murrow with John Kennedy when he was a senator. And 2/3 of the speech of John Kennedy was about war and rearming the Air Force, and he mentions going against Russia. And then the same evening they had a movie made by CBS and Time and Life on General MacArthur and how he was removed. And, of course, the tone of it was he warned us that we'd have to get to war in Asia, and, of course, he wanted the atomic bombs then. And the sabers, I say, are rattling in the paper every day. There's a resume, I think, of the Gallup poll this week, or one of the polls, that Jimmy Carter's too soft on Russia. I keep harping about Brzezinski or Solzhenitsyn. We have a war machine that is ready to go to war, and all we have to do is get enough unemployment in this country, enough fighting on the streets and terror to bring out the police. They're ready. Are you ready? And how did it all begin? Well, the book I'm talking about is called The Plot Against the Peace. This is another oldie that you should get, and I might suggest that you try to buy these books, if you can, at used bookstores or wherever they're sold. And if you pick up extras and you don't want them and you want to send them my way, I'll reimburse you for them. This is by Michael Sayers. It was written in 1945, and he's the man who wrote the book, The Great Conspiracy. This book is The Plot Against the Peace, and he goes back to the early years before Adolf Hitler. And I'm going to read some of this to you because it's terribly important, and then you can try to locate the book yourself. I hope you'll be able to. But he has a discussion here about Germany before Hitler came to power, that Hitler was simply hand-selected, which I've intimated or said outright for a long time, that Adolf Hitler was hand-selected by the powers that be a long time ago, and that he wasn't the man who instigated or plotted all this pain or suffering, that Hitler was the front for a group that were intending to do their damage for a long, long time. The part I just want to go into a little bit, of course I can't do much of it in this short time, is called The Secret History of Nazism. And the chapter it's part 2, chapter 5, from page 85, let's see how far this goes back to 107, is the real secret of the way Nazism began. And this is what Mr. Michael Sayer says. He says, the rule of the Teutonic Order prevailed in Germany for centuries. Of course, we always hear when we talk about conspiracies that there always were conspiracies. He says that the Teutonic Order went on in Germany in the Middle Ages. There was a secret caste rule. In the 16th century, people were drowned in oceans of blood to keep the hands of the people off the feudal castles, of course. The feudal order is what ruled, and the masses were to obey and take their orders and die for the feudal lords in various wars that maintained the feudal castles. In 1848, the Germans, the peasants, workers, and burghers revolted against the leadership of a man named Karl Schurz, and again they were suppressed. Until 1918, Germany was a monarchy under Kaiser Wilhelm II. Until 1933, Germany was a republic under social democratic ministers. From 1933 on, Germany was a fascist dictator under Adolf Hitler. And yet, Michael Sayer says that the same people ruled under each regime. The same men ruled in Germany. There was a political facade that there were changes from Kaiser Wilhelm to the social democracy, but this was a facade, and the reins of power stayed in the hands of a few thousand military leaders and industrialists, and that this staff became the permanent government of Germany. Now, there are 4 areas that he stresses that were taken over completely, and this applies to America today and the world today. The economists, the technologists, the schools and universities, the political system was controlled by these few thousand people. He said the German general staff existed for a single purpose: war and world conquest. The continuity of German aggression since 1918 reflects the opinion of the general staff, and it's that the chief members of the supreme command of the Nazi Wehrmacht were the very same people that took part in the First World War. They were part of the Kaiser's high command. The men who created Hitler's Panzer Division was Mr. von Rundstedt, von Brockisch, and von Kleist, and von Bock, and von Witzplan. All same rulers of the Prussian military caste. They all participated in leading officers in World War I under the Kaiser. The head of the Kaiser's military intelligence was Colonel Walter Nicolai. He was the secret organizer of the Nazi military intelligence. The head of the Kaiser's naval intelligence was Admiral Canaris, and he was the secret organizer of the Nazi naval intelligence. The German industry was run by the Kaiser, for the Kaiser, were the Krupps, Thyssen, the Hugenbergs, the Stinnes, the Kirchdorf. He mentions these corporations, and they were the same people who financed Adolf Hitler, built the war machine, and conquered the Nazi armies and took care of them and made economic colonies after World War II all over the world. They had a secret law, the Pan-German group, and the secret law was described in a book, never to cease to represent or perpetuate themselves, to stay immortal. The general staff was successfully resurrected, and German militarism after 1918 began their plotting immediately, just as they plotted their way after World War II. And then in 1945, they had the same plans to recontinue World War III, and they were better prepared now because they were spread out all over the world. The ultimate goal of the secret ruling combine, known as by the German staff as the Pan-German World Group, their secret goal, their ultimate goal, is to take over the world. And they're very close to it now. I believe they're close to it now, much closer than people realize. Hitler, in quotes, like the Kaiser, had been the political instrument of the century-old Pan-German master plan. In the first pages of Mein Kampf, Hitler reveals from the earliest day that he was a pupil of the Pan-Germans in Austria. During his trial in Munich in 1924, when he was arrested and put in jail for 8.5 months, he said, "I left Vienna a confirmed anti-Semite, a deadly foe of the Marxist philosophy, and a Pan-German in my political principles. The original Pan-German plan called to mobilize millions of German immigrants in every country as part of a secret instrument of German military aggression and conquest. The advent of Hitler's fascism in Germany meant that the German General Staff was able to draw into its conspiracy every fascist and pro-fascist element throughout the entire world. All national boundaries and limits dissolved, as they have dissolved, and their goal is the enslavement of free people everywhere. Right now, our congressman from California, Panetta, has a bill before Congress to stop selling farmland to out-of-the-country nationalities. I think the Saudi Arabians, the Iranians. 30% of all agriculture in the United States is being bought up with this money, which I think is the Nazi money outside the country, in order to take control of the United States and, of course, our farms and our foods. Michael Sayers said the Nazi alliance of pan-Germanism was international and spread what is known as the fifth column, which they have now in every country, and it developed before World War II that they could take over Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Austria, Czechoslovakia. All these countries had a network, France, of what is known as the fifth column that prepared for them, and they were ready to take over. According to Sayers, he says Nazism, the fascist phase of pan-Germanism, was initiated into Germany immediately after the armistice of 1918. It was by the direct instigation of the German General Staff. Almost all features of Hitler's regime, the aggressiveness, the brutality, the homicidal racial chauvinism, appeared very early, and there are many books and warnings of exactly what was going to happen. It wasn't as secret as some people like to pretend. I was brought up to believe when Hitler went into Poland that he had gone just too far and we were taken by surprise, but this was far from the truth. The Pan-German League was formed in 1894 and was well on its way 30 years before Adolf Hitler was even selected as their particular front. One of the first members of the Pan-German League was an industrialist named Alfred Hugenberg. He was a millionaire. From 1894 to 1918, Mr. Hugenberg financed Hitler's military machine. From 1923 to 1933, he put his vast fortune into newspapers and radio stations placed to the disposal of Nazism. In February of 1945, when Hitler's regime nearly collapsed, Mr. Hugenberg was 79 years old. He was a pan-German industrialist, and he still held the position of senior member of Hitler's Reichstag. Through Mr. Hugenberg and other persons like Mr. Kurdorf and Krupp and Thysens, the Pan-German League was the richest, most powerful organization of its kind in Germany, with its goal for world conquest. As I say, it penetrated the political system, the schools, the university, the press, and the scientific institutions. And those are the ones that are written up in Project Paperclip, but not even properly defined. As soon as World War II was over, the top czarist Nazis went into our political system and formed that National Security Council. They went into our schools and educations. In fact, George DeMohrenschildt was teaching college. His brother, Mr. von Mohrenschildt, was teaching at Princeton or Rutgers when he came to the United States. Many of them were teaching at universities. They took over the press and scientific institutions. When the Warren Report was being written, they called in Mr. Otto Winokur, the historian from the Pentagon, to write, send the writers for the Warren Report, and he was a German also. They had branches all over the world in the United States, South and Central America, the Balkans, and inside Russia. And the agents inside Russia, of course, are the ones that I believe are linked to Marina Oswald's family. Here it says from the outset, we have to make this clear because only understanding this concept will explain what you read in your headlines today about the Depression or the Bakke decision or the Jarvis Amendment. From the outset, pan-Germanism envisions a war of enslavement of whole peoples. You see, Mr. Bakke was put in as a test case to stop the preferential treatment of a minute fraction of blacks, preferential, of course, being in quotes. And he was very well constructed through the military and through NASA and the defense industries to make the roads clear for all whites who have high IQs. And that, of course, will push out minorities who haven't had that special training and grooming in science and math that you need to get into these schools. The work of the pan-Germanism, of course, was to take all of Europe and the Russians and the Black Sea and then spread all over the world. The First World War was calling for a new Europe. They wanted to take Austria, Holland, Belgium, Flanders, Lorraine, Switzerland, France, and so forth. But that war was stopped, and they got smarter after the end of World War I. These same people that were in power through World War II and guided the Reich up till the brink of World War III got smarter at the end of World War I and II. In 1893, the goal of the leader of pan-Germanism, Count Gottlieb, announced that the German people have to prepare themselves to take by force what they need. Our civilization must build its temples on mountains of corpses, oceans of tears, and innumerable dying men. Now, nobody's asked if, by coincidence, this Count Gottlieb is related to the Gottlieb who ran the medical experiments with Nazis after World War II that began the mind control that Allen Dulles set up. He brought the Nazis to America and to South America and let them loose to run all over the world. And we have in Fort Derrick, Maryland, and the CIA and the operations of the mind control, a Dr. Gottlieb. And these names just may be as common as Smith or Brown, but like the Warren Commission, we're not asking the right questions, and we're not finding out enough about Dr. Gottlieb in the CIA with his mind control to see if he's any relationship to the great Gottlieb, Count Gottlieb, who formed the pan-German motto of taking civilizations that we need and prepare yourselves, and it will be done on corpses and tears and from innumerable dying men. We read about psychological studies of alleged assassins or patsies. I just wonder why our modern psychiatric field today hasn't gone into the mentality not only of these people who state such goals, who are mass murderers. We pin out a man who's murdered one or two people. We never go into the mind of the political mass murderers who led us, as I say, to the brink of World War III. There were a lot of warnings of what was going to come down before Hitler blossomed out. And I think that's important because there are quotations in this book of newspapers and books that came out clearly laying the groundwork of the rearmament of Germany and the creation of Adolf Hitler and the warning about the wars that would follow. And people ignored them. I've been told many times that you can't use newspapers for research, you can't use books or articles, you have to use particular documents. Where do you get the documents? You can pick up the whole script of the plans for the wars of the future if you read the daily newspapers like I do, and that's a lot of hogwash. There's material published every day, just like these books were written by Michael Sayers, warning about, he's written in the 40s, on these various connivings and conspiracies, and we should have been able to see connections so that when Mr. Schacht, Hallmar Schacht, and these various people work with Nasser in Egypt, we know that the Nazis are still operating. They're not done away with, and they finance Hitler, and they're financing the armies today and the mental hospitals, and yet we're not taking these names and demanding that the chain of connections of their work be put together, find out who brought them here, who funded them, how they've affected our foreign policy today. There were books on early pan-Germanism that are quoted in Michael Sayers' book, one written in 1904 called A Pure Germany. Now this was a book with the stated goals before there ever was an Adolf Hitler. The book, The Pure Germany, says what we take we must also keep. A foreign territory is not incorporated until the day when German property rights are rooted in its soil. A process of expropriation should be inaugurated. Take the Poles, the Alsatians, the Lorraines, and so forth. We must transport ourselves to the interior of the empire and let the Germans replace them on the frontiers. In 1905, Joseph Ludwig Reimer wrote a book, Pan-German Germany. He said, we derive and must derive a world empire of Teutonic stock under the hegemony of the German people. In 1906, in a book titled War, Klaus Wagner wrote, let us bravely organize great forces, migrations into inferior people of Europe. Posterity will be grateful to us. Coercion will be necessary. They must be driven into reserves where we shall keep them separated and segregated and obtain the space necessary for our expansion. In 1911, the pan-German Otto Richard Tannenberg wrote, the German nation is fighting for the world empire. In 1913, Chancellor of the Reich, Heinrich Class, wrote, in a classic "If I Were Kaiser," in quotes, "We must close our hearts to compassion. The Jewish race is the source of all dangers. The Jew and the German are like fire and water. Little countries like Holland and Belgium have lost their right to exist. France must be crushed once and for all. Let war be sacred to us. Let it be welcome as the physician of our soul. We await the Führer. Have patience." This was written in 1913, prior to World War II. More about Adolf Hitler and the mass control, mind control of the This is Mae Brussell, July the 7th, 1978, Side 2, tape number 335. On Side 1 of this tape, number 334, I was quoting from a book that I'm going to continue reading from and referring to by Michael Sayers, published in 1945, called The Plot Against the Peace. Michael Sayers also wrote the book The Great Conspiracy, and it's a background of the Tsarists and the Germans and connivings of setting up World War II and laying the groundwork for World War III, the way we got into these wars. And I think that being as we're on the brinkmanship of total world wars every day and small wars every day, it's very important to study these matters. And the point I was trying to make on the other side, and I'll continue to make, is that there was a lot of forewarning early in the media, in books, magazines, and articles, of everything that was going to come down if the people wanted to see it. And that is the important thing. The mass media, the way it's brainwashed, is exemplified in this book and explained, and also references to the books, and I'll give you some titles, where the plans for Adolf Hitler were publicly proclaimed, and that there was every warning of what was going to happen if the people wanted to read it. The newspapers and magazines and books had articles about the Führer, getting ready for the Führer. They used the word the Führer, Heil the Kaiser, Heil the Army, and they were quite open about their intent to conquer the world. In 1919, there was a Reichswehr instructor, or a spy, stationed as a corporal at a depot in Munich, who was organizing the German Workers' Party and reorganizing it to fit in with the general staff of the post-war period. And the captain who gave these orders was Captain Ernest Röhm, R-O-E-H-M, who founded the Reichsflag, who was in charge of the political intrigue in Munich, Germany, when Adolf Hitler got started. One of the first spies to work for Röhm, who was discovered by Röhm, was Adolf Hitler, who was selected by the Pan-Germans to be the front for the reorganizing of Germany and the conquering of the world. Not that Hitler didn't have ideas of his own, but he was discovered by these huge corporations and was put into power. Hitler joined the German Workers' Party as a member number 7. Other members were Captain Ernest Röhm and Anton Drexler and Dietrich Eckart. And there's a list of people who later worked their way up into the Nazi Party. One was Rudolf Hess, and the Baltic White Guard, his group, and the anti-Semitic propagandist from Tsarist Russia by the name of Alfred Rosenberg. Now the plan, as I say, that's repeated in this book over and over: take over the army, the political machinery, the academic life, and the industrial life. And then the way they could do this was to go into psychological warfare. There's a book quoted here called German Psychological Warfare, and it says that the Germans had to undergo a lot of changes after World War I, and they decided that the best way to get the masses going along with them would be a psychological rearmament after the Versailles Treaty. The General Staff threw its full weight behind the psychological rearmament plan, which, it states on page 94, the Americans, the Allies, had no understanding of the German use of psychology as a weapon of war. What was written in 1945 is true in 1978. The American people, as yet, have absolutely no inkling of the massive amount of use of mind control to control them through TV and the movies and so forth. The General Staff masked its psychological rearmament as anti-Bolshevism and nationalism, and of course that's what we're doing today. We call it anti-terrorism and just outright anti-Bolshevism still as the secret tool to rally the people. There was a book out by Colonel Walter Nicolai called Secret Powers that was published in 1924 that stated quite openly that immediately after the armistice, the General Staff began planning war mobilization morale for the German masses. They formed the German League, the Fatherland Party, the German Workers, National Socialist Party, and propaganda was a political weapon. And the Supreme Commander, this is Mr. Ludendorff and Mr. Nicolai from the Pan-German group, they set up a staff that would require a leader in the future. They were going to create, according to their assistants, a German Führer who would carry along their secret war plans until they could come out in the open. They decided they would create what they would call a Führer, that they would have symbols, and that they have a superstructure that would be easy to follow. And they rallied on the press, the radio, motion pictures, and popular entertainment in order to influence foreign nations as well as people in Germany. And the psychological work was taken over by the German General Staff, the military, immediately after the armistice and the end of World War I, and 20 years before Germany proclaimed Nazi power. In 1925, Mein Kampf was published, and literally hundreds of the books and scientific treatises were written about it by the pan-German theorists, and they go into the part of the psychological rearmament plan of the General Staff. Now, there are various books written here, that titles in this book, Plot Against the Peace, and I'm going to give you some of the titles and quotations, one in 1920 by Otto Spengler, who talked about the authoritarian, anti-democratic, anti-revolutionary process that would be formed that was later taken over by the Nazis. In 1921, a book by Mr. Rubarth called Propaganda as a Political Instrument. Another one in 1922 called The Second World War by Mr. Graziger. Another book in 1922, that's the year I was born, by Mr. K. Hesse called Warlord Psychology, A Search for the Leader of the German Future. Another book in 1922, German Propaganda and the Science of Propaganda as a Practical Social Science by Mr. J. Plenge. They use the universities and the educational establishments to help them with the psychological warfare of creating a Führer and a symbol. In 1924, a book came out called The Art of Influencing the Masses in the United States of America by Mr. Schoenman. 1925, a book by Mr. Hoff, Economic and Political Tasks of Germandom Abroad. You see, these books laid the groundwork for all Germans all over to study. They were textbooks on how to study what's coming down, and then they could put it into action. Now, this is happening now. There's literally thousands of books out now that are going to tell us exactly how the future is going to come down. And the people involved with it can read it and understand it and study it. And the victims are too stupid. We're too busy going to the movies, bad movies, watching bad television, not having discussion groups, not sitting around and trying to understand the problem. That is except for all the people that subscribe to formerly Dialogue Conspiracy and now World Watchers International. I mean, you're a select elite group who want to get titles of books, read books, send me books and information, and are genuinely concerned with the past and particularly the present and into the future. But the warning systems were all there for Jew and Gentile alike, and the future victims. It was all spelled out, and there was no excuse for stupidity except the lack of people to accept reality. And it's the reality that is ever present, and the denial of it is like digging your own grave, and that also is a reality. Whether you dig it or not, it is a reality you have to face. But when somebody else is digging it every day and writing about it, I never have been able to figure out why more people weren't curious about it. The birth of Nazi Germany, according to Michael Sayers, happened at 6:30 a.m. in the morning of March 13th, 1920. That was when the first major political push of the underground German General Staff. 6:30 a.m., March 13th, 1920. You might put it on your calendars for whatever it's worth. That's when the First World War went into operation in Berlin after the First World War, And this is the date when the Pan-Germans decided that they would form what is known as international fascism. Dr. Wolfgang Kapp, K-A-P-P, led the push. He was a fanatical Pan-German. He was born in Brooklyn in the United States of America. There was General von Lüttwitz, his second in command, who was the Kaiser's military governor in Brussels and commanded the Reichswehr. He married a rich American woman who helped him out, and Major Pabst, another general staff agent who helped command the Pan-Germans. They got together and made what they called a new order for Berlin, and Hitler then was dispatched from Munich, Germany, by a special military plan to contact the people in the Kapp's new order for Pan-Germanism and set up their propaganda. All elements of the German democracy were alive at that time. They set up strikes, they immobilized the German workers. The anti-militarists were thrown away, swept away at this time period when Hitler was brought into Munich in the 20s as their front. But they held on a little longer, like our fumbling democracy almost went completely under with John Mitchell and Richard Nixon and the multinational corporations and the aerospace and so forth, setting up that police state in 1972. We almost lost it then, and I feel sincerely we're on the brink of it now. Mr. Kapp, as I say, set up this new order, proclaimed this push, and he had some more time. He had a General von Lüttwitz who handed over the command to what were called the Democrats. The Democratic government was trying to hold up in Germany after World War I, and the man to hold it up came in and started screaming against Bolshevism, and he actually worked for the Pan-Germans, and they thought they were safe. This reminds me of being on the brink of World War III and fascism and the Gestapo that James McCord talked about at the time of Watergate, and we held it for a while, and they put in a Democrat, a peanut farmer from Georgia, wearing blue jeans and fishing with his wife at 6 in the morning, and his little Amy, out tugging along the sewing machine into the White House and carrying his papers and his old shoes. And he turns out to be nothing but a front. He always was for the Rockefellers we were talking about on these programs in the Trilateral. And his military background at Annapolis with Mr. Turner, who turned out then to be the head of the CIA, and he was in Annapolis with Patrick Gray. People believe that democracy was functioning in this great election we had when Jimmy Carter was elected president. Identical to Germany, the Democrat that was put in here to save the democracy is part of the Pan-German team right now. At that time, they felt that the propaganda against Russia was very necessary, that the fascist organizations were necessary to protect them against Bolshevism. And of course, 3 years later, the General Staff took over with another big push, and they began their anti-Bolshevism with a big shove and a yell. And that's when their trained agitator, Adolf Hitler, surfaced. Now, the New York Times, January 28, 1923, reported that Adolf Hitler was marching into the Bavarian capital with his fascisti. Now, that's from the New York Times in 1923, that he had a pan-German imperial flag. The colors were red and black and white, that they had the swastika and a circle, the circle field of white, and this was going with Hitler into Munich. The German General Staff introduced Hitler to the fascist circles in the United States, and Pan-German Count Hugo Lerchenfeld had married an American heiress, and she told the newspapers that in Bavaria, in quotes, we have a new prophet. He's arisen, and we have faith in him. His name is Adolf Hitler, and he will lead the Socialist Labor Party. And Hitler's creed, of course, from the very beginning was this great anti-Semitism which rallied all of them. Like Mussolini, he came along with his socialism and internationalism and the anti-Semitism, which was the glue that held this together, because there were so many Jews that helped overthrow the Tsar and create communism in Russia. This was the rallying point here. The Jews will do it here, and he juiced them all up to go after one segment of the society and give them the arms necessary to attack this handful of Jews. The New York Times, again, February the 8th, 1923, had an article that two of Hitler's lieutenants, whom the French francs and American dollars had depended upon, had been arrested in Germany. The Bavarian Diet had long had money that two people that were funded by American money had been temporarily held up. Now, Hitler was arrested for a while, but his money was coming from Henry Ford, and the New York Times says the Hitler movement was financed by the anti-Semitic chief Henry Ford in America. Mr. Ford's interest in the Bavarian anti-Jewish movement began a year ago when Mr. Ford's agents came into contact with Dietrich Eckart, the notorious pan-German. Shortly after Eckart had asked Ford for financial aid, the agent then returned to America and got Mr. Ford's money to come to Munich. Herr Hitler openly boasts of Mr. Ford's support. He praises Mr. Ford not only as a great individualist, but as a great anti-Semite. Now, pan-Germans were busy with Sir Henry de Terting, the Anglo-Dutch chairman of the Oil Trust, the Royal Dutch Shell, and of course, during World War I and after World War II, Prince Bernhard, the Nazi czars, married Queen Juliana in the Netherlands and runs the Bilderberger now and directs which countries are to be overthrown or conquered. Hitler was temporarily put into prison at the time of this great insurrection. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As I said before, he served 8.5 months in what they said was comfortable confinement on a military fortress at Landsberg. Now that reminds me of the Watergate defendants and all of our white-collar criminals that go to these special prisons once they have to be confined. Michael Sayers writes, again this is from the book, The Plot Against the Peace, one of the first persons to visit Hitler at Landberg was the pan-German professor of geography at the University of Munich, Dr. Karl Hofshofer, one of the chief scientific experts on underground German general staff. Hofshofer was the inventor of the Nazi science of geopolitics. In 1908, the Bavarian General Staff sent Hofshofer, then Major Hofshofer, on a 2-year mission to Japan. He contacted the Japanese militarists. He planned the future of the military alliance between Germany and Japan. He wrote in his book called Dai Nippon that the war between Japan and the United States was inevitable, that there would be a Japanese campaign against China that they decided upon. This was all written in 1913, and that there would be a collaboration with Japan, which, in quotes, was a natural necessity. And of course, after the Nazis took power in Germany and Adolf Hitler was out of his fancy prison on the army base, Mr. Hofshofer was appointed the head of a geopolitical institute in Berlin with 1,000 scientists and technicians, and they studied the problems of, in quotes, world conquest. While in prison, Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, which was a combination of pan-German, fascist, and anti-Semitic propaganda. The names that run through this book, The Plot Against the Peace, continue after World War II, and that's the important thing. I'm reading some of these names now that were important in building up Germany at the end of World War I. But then Allen Dulles, again on the Warren Commission, representative of the huge corporations, brought these Nazis. He was the main instrument of funneling them all over the world as soon as they realized that Adolf Hitler was going to lose the Second War. The goal for world conquest is there, and it really looks, I'm depressed about it. Of course, it looks like they're winning. April the 16th, 1943, a Berlin dispatch to the New York Times revealed that the secret rearmament of Germany was underway as far back as 1921. They pointed out that Germans began experimenting with secret arms construction as early as 1921. At that time, the German Republic, had hardly been born. They were heavy industries that were devoted to new guns, and they hid them. And the way they hid them is important because they used dummy front organizations that I may do some about next week and give you the title so you can see how all these weapons and gases and ammunition can be manufactured, and they're under the names of companies in Europe that don't sound like the Krupps or IG Farben. By 1924, 3 years after the Versailles Treaty that was supposed to disarm Germany, Colonel William Taylor, a European agent of the American DuPont Corporation, wrote memorandums saying, in quotes, the German monopoly in military material is passing into the German hands. In 1925, a report of investigators from the Inter-Allied Control Commission accused Germany of secret rearmament for a Second World War. This was 1925. In Berlin, in January 1925, Mr. Gustav Stresemann said that Germany, in quotes, is fully disarmed in accordance with the Versailles Treaty, and all statements to the contrary are fairy tales, end quotes. The German generals said, in quotes, "What would they do? How could they rearm with only 100,000 men? Germany can't even fight a defensive war today," end quotes. The United States, the German-American press, the pan-German propaganda immediately went to the defense of the persecuted. How can you say, these lecturers asked, and the editorials asked of the writers, that you can pick on these poor Germans? They went through a lot in World War I. In January 1925, a literary digest, magazine called Literary Digest, came out in behalf of the Germans. The St. Louis Westlake Press came out in behalf of the Germans. Pittsburgh German newspaper was denouncing the Inter-Allied Control Commission and said they're simply parasites living off the fat of the land at the expense of enslaved people. Again, Milwaukee newspaper said that German people are disarmed. They have no interest in war. A New York German paper said that people have bad faith and they are charging conspiracies in Germany that are not true. Inside Germany, meanwhile, they were being armed, and the people that were exposing the rearming of Germany were killed, just like the witnesses to the assassinations and the conspiracies in the United States are killed. The pattern was set up by the early Gestapo, and those that warned got it. There was a Dr. Ziegner, former Prime Minister of Saxony, who was charged for high treason, and he was waiting his charges, and he revealed, in quotes, in January 1925, that the enemy powers have the connection for illegal rearmament organizations and that they are reorganizing. As I say, he was charged with treason. In January 1925, a chemist named Walter Bollerhahn was put on trial in a German court for treason. He said that there were secret arsenals, that there was the Black Reichswehr, that there was the existence of these arsenals, and that he wanted to give the information to the Allies. The German court then sent him to prison for 15 years for treason, and I'm sure he never got out of that prison alive. It doesn't say in this book, but Michael Sayers doesn't follow it up to say if he lived from 1925 till when this was written in 1945. There were other authors. There was a famous editor of an anti-militarist paper, and he was convicted in a court of treason because he published facts in his journal that would have led to the disclosure of German secret war plans. And this man, his name was Odesetsky, was thrown into a concentration camp, and he was murdered there. And they have that information. In Nation magazine, March 11, 1925, an article by Edgar Ansel Maurer called Treason in the German Republic, and he said, Cap of the Kapp Push, K-A-P-P, Captain Erhard, Erich Ludendorff are not traitors, just as the assassins of Mr. Liebknecht and Walter Rathow Erzberger are not murderers. It depends on the motive. A traitor is not a traitor when he seeks to restore the monarchy or institute of a military dictatorship. A venerable German pacifist, like Professor Ludwig Udall, who publishes a letter calling attention to clandestine activity of the German government, is a traitor. And it was quite open that anybody who was exposing the team was a traitor, and anybody who worked for them was all right. He didn't commit a crime, and he wasn't a criminal if he belonged to these organizations that were arming and preparing very carefully the swastika, the man, the message, the way to mesmerize the people to fall for it. I have a book I'll do some tapes on in case you can't get it, by a man named Paul, P-O-L, Heinz Paul, who wrote The Hidden Enemy, similar to Michael Sayers, who wrote The Great Conspiracy, and this book I'm referring to, The Plot Against the Peace. And this is what he describes in his book about the Pan-German League in Berlin in 1930. In quotes, they had a large meeting in Berlin where the speaker's platform was occupied by the top princes in Europe, August Wilhelm, Oscar and Idol Wilhelm. They had people there dressed as stormtroopers. There were 4 delegates from the Reichswehr. This was in 1930. From the ministry, dignified officers lending support to the new government that was going to come into power. This was 1930. There was Colonel von Hindenburg, the son of the president of the Reich, and entered next to him. Close to Hindenburg sat Hjalmar Schacht. That's the same man that I've mentioned on several tapes for the last few weeks, whose political career began in the Pan-German League. he doesn't mention here, but I mentioned it before, and it's in the other books, that Hallmarschak was a financier behind Adolf Hitler. He was a financier behind Aristotle Onassis and building up the German fleet after 1950. As soon as our wounds were over from World War II, he was the man behind Nasser and the Bormann Brotherhood, the Nazi organization of the Middle East. In 1930, Mr. Hallmarschak was pushing his agents of the Pan-German League. Behind Schaks had representatives of the German industry who represented billions of marks, people from the coal syndicate, the electric concerns. The Pan-German League had Mr. Blohm, B-L-O-H-M, co-owner of the Hamburg shipyards. Those are the ones that Aristotle Onassis was to build up with his Argentine Nazi connections. Stormtroopers, the elite guard in uniform, delegates from the Nazi Party, including Hermann Goering in civilian clothes at this time, with the party as an official of the Reichstag deputy, and then Rudolf Hess, the personal envoy of Adolf Hitler. Mr. Goering in civilian clothes reminds me of Ethel Younger, the Attorney General of California, with his links to the Gestapo, the FBI, the Nazis, the secret police, the killing teams, the cover-up artists, the mass murders and terrorism in the state of California with its international connections, who's now running for governor of California in his civilian clothes. We'll do more about Younger maybe next week or the week after, both sides of a tape on Ethel Younger, because he is running for governor of California. The Pan-Germans began, as I said, years earlier, and when Adolf Hitler came into power, they had been working many, many years trying to get control of the world, long before they had selected Hitler as their agent. And their meetings were coming together in Berlin, 1930, described. They were getting ready to take over the world, and their next push was putting Hitler into power in the electoral process in 1933. In the fall of 1918, the general staff of this Pan-American group had taken billions of marks. In 1918, as soon as the war was over, and they put them in Sweden, Holland, Switzerland, Spain, Argentina, Brazil, and other countries. By June 1919, their emigrated capital, with which the German interests were to settle all over the world, was about 35 billion marks. The Dutch aviation flyer wrote in his book, The Flying Dutchman, that entire military aviation plants were taken out of Germany and put in Holland, that the Dornier Airplane Company was built in Lake Constance in Switzerland, the Rohrblock plant was transferred to Denmark, the Heikel and Junkers establishment was put in Sweden. All the transfers were done by the German General Staff, the Pan-American group that was put together World War I, World War II, and is now working World War III. Baron Manfred von Killinger, the Imperial Army officer, later the Nazi Council in the United States, started a company in Spain, in Echeverria, Spain, and they built new types of submarines for the Krupp family, but changed the name to look like a Spanish firm. The industrialists, the German industrialists, again quoting the New York Times, January the 30th, 1945, put huge capital foundations in Sweden, and under the Swedish Patent Office, they gave them a Swedish, with 50% of them were German firms. They resettled the IG Farben, Zeiss Icon, Bosch, Daimler, and Baines companies, the huge AEG and Stevens company. German capital went into neutral Sweden, and only a fraction of the capital which Germany had was secreted abroad. They sent much of it overseas and put it in these other countries, getting ready for the framework of what I call today's headlines. Collier's magazine had an article in 1945, February the 3rd, saying that the German firm of IG Farben had built chemical plants, was building them now in Madrid. In March 1944, IG Farben had their synthetic oil plant near Cordoba in Spain. They used a Spanish name called Calvo Sotelo, supposed to be controlled by the Spaniards, actually IG Farben, completely owned by IG Farben. The Spanish multimillionaire Juan March, who financed Franco's fascist regime and put $60 million, was actually a German spy in World War I. He was an agent of the Krupp Corporation and collaborated with Hitler's chief of the Navy, Admiral Canaris, the head of German naval intelligence. And today he's providing commercial fronts. That's when this book was written in 1945 for German capital that was put into Spain and Spanish outlets throughout all South America. Remember, the book I'm quoting is from Michael Sayers called The Plot Against the Peace, and the plot he's talking about is what you're feeling and reading in your headlines now. Civil rights group are crying, as I say, about the Bakke decision. A lot of people are shaken up minorities by the Jarvis scan. They don't make the connections of Mr. Jarvis to running the campaigns of Richard Nixon or working with Ronald Reagan or the direct links to the Gestapo that James McCord was talking about at one time and tried to stem the tide even for a few years. Portugal was a center of German financial and industrial activity. In 1945, there's a quotation in Michael Sayers' book, again, New York Times, January the 12th, 1944, saying, like Spain, Portugal teams with German agents in Lisbon is where they go on down to penetrate all of South America through Portuguese commercial fronts. As you can see, I'm only reading sections from chapters from a book by Michael Sayers called The Plot Against the Peace. For any person that wants to study the news, this is a very important book to obtain. Until next week, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.